It's good to see you guys. We are so glad to be here with y'all today. Just over the last few months, I know Britt and I have just felt welcome, that we have just felt a part of this family, and I just want to say thank you for that. We love being here. We love church here and community here, and just it's just such a blessing. So, yeah. So good morning, and it's an exciting day. And I think Victor last week he kicked us off in a new sermon series, right, called 52 Days. And so he jump started this new series for us, and we're going to be getting back into that today. And what 52 Days is all about, we're looking at the life and the story of Nehemiah. And no, bring it on. And so we're looking at the life and the story of Nehemiah, and it's called 52 Days because it took 52 days from Nehemiah and the Jews start to finish to build the wall around Jerusalem, which is an amazing feat. It's pretty crazy. And in that, some of the things Victor talked about was that Nehemiah was just an ordinary guy. He was just a regular guy, but he had this extraordinary moment with God, and it led him to do a few things. Right? It led him to a broken heart. It led him to sit down to cry, to kneel and pray, and to stand up and act. And what that did for Nehemiah is it changes us, and it changed him, and it shifted the trajectory of Nehemiah's life to something completely different. And so when that happened in Nehemiah's life, he began to kind of figure out exactly what the Lord was leading him to do. He defined the mission clearly. And then he took that and he began to plan carefully. And then from there, he brought other people into that mission, other people into that plan, and inspired them to join in with him. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. That's the point from which we jump off. And if you know Nehemiah, you know that he was a cupbearer for a Persian king named Cyrus. And so he was the cupbearer. He was in the king's court. He had a pretty comfy life living in the king's court. I mean, other than being the cupbearer, and if something was bad in there, it didn't turn out too great. Other than that, he lived a pretty safe, pretty comfortable life. And Nehemiah felt like God was leading him to return back to Jerusalem because he had been hearing that other Jews had been going back there to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple, and to start living in Jerusalem and living the holy lifestyle that God had been leading his people towards. And Nehemiah wanted to be a part of that. And he felt the call to go and rebuild the city walls. And so he asked this Persian king if he could go. And not only did the king say yes, but he sent him with material and with money, and sent him along the way, gave him approval for it, and basically gave the king's stamp of approval to go. And that's where we pick up. Nehemiah has left. He's started to build the wall. And so we know, just kind of based off of what Victor was introducing us in last week, what we're going to be talking about this week is that when you begin to do the things that God is leading you to do, when you step out and you walk forward in what God has planned for you, we can be sure of one thing, that one thing will absolutely happen. That discouragement will come. It's going to come. Because there's an enemy who wants you dead. He wants to steal everything he possibly can from you. And he wants to destroy what was given to us by God. Our identity, the gifts that God has given us, our families. He wants to completely wreck that from us. And in 1 Peter 5:8, the scriptures say that the adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. He wants to eat you alive. And so when God alters the trajectory of our life, when he introduces this extraordinary moment in the lives of ordinary people, it changes the course that we're moving in. It shifts things. And when God changes the trajectory of our lives, the enemy is ready to attack. He's ready to step in and stop it. And that was true for Nehemiah as well. But the temptation for us, looking at Nehemiah's story, is to think that he shouldn't face disappointment, that Nehemiah shouldn't face discouragement or opposition, because Nehemiah left a pretty comfortable situation to follow what God wanted for him. And sometimes we can tend to think that, well, if God was leading it, if God was doing that in Nehemiah's life, shouldn't it be easy? Shouldn't it be problem-free if God is the one leading us and leading Nehemiah to go do that? But this is really important, that discouragement and problems are not the opposite of following in God's will, following in God's plan. Problems and opposition is not counter to God leading us, but rather this, that we face spiritual discouragement not because we're doing something wrong, but because we're doing something right. Now, I'll also say that doesn't mean that opposition and discouragement mean that we're doing everything right. Sometimes we just make some pretty terrible choices, right? Yeah. Sometimes the opposition that we face is really to get us back on the right track. It is God introducing something to change our trajectory back where he wants us to be. And so there's two different things, right? Sometimes we face opposition like the disciples faced, persecution, where we're doing the right thing, we're following in God's plan, and because of it, the enemy is set against us, and the world is set against us, and so we face opposition. And sometimes that discouragement and that opposition is a lot more like the prodigal son, eating the slop of the pigs, nudging us back in the right way. So either way, whether you're following in God's plan, whether you're following God's mission for you or you're not, whether you're doing good or you're bad, doesn't matter. You're going to face opposition and discouragement. Either way. So we have to choose what kind of hard we want to follow in. Do we want the hard from foolish decisions that lead to a harder life? Or do we want the hard that is doing eternal things that make an eternal difference, and because of that, the enemy is set against us? And I think that's a pretty easy choice. Because by pursuing our godly calling, we become a threat to the enemy. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today in Nehemiah. We'll be in chapter 4 if you want to follow along, but that's what we're going to be looking at. And when we look at the story of Nehemiah, there are two ways the enemy will try to discourage us. Now, our enemy will try to discourage us from the outside. Right, so in the story, Nehemiah is building the walls, right? He's building the walls around Jerusalem. So the enemy will try to discourage us from outside the walls. That's what this looks like in Nehemiah. You turn to chapter 4, verse 1. It says, "Now when Sanballat heard that they were building the wall, he was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. And he said in the presence of his brothers and of the army of Samaria, 'What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore it for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish and the burned ones at that?' Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, 'Yes, what they are building, if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall.'" There will be criticism. When there's opposition outside of the walls, there will be criticism. And Sanballat, so this guy that we just read about, Sanballat, he was probably either a local governor, or he would soon become one, because we know he was a governor at some point in this region. And we also know that just based upon his name and just some of the background we have of him, he most likely grew up in the area near Jerusalem. Okay, so put those two things together. You have a guy who is seeking power, who's seeking authority, seeking leadership. His hometown is near Jerusalem, and so his desire is that he would like to be the one leading Jerusalem. he would like to be the one in control of that region. And when he looks out and he sees that the Jews begin building the wall, who's in control? Not Sanballat. It's Nehemiah. And so just like when I was reading this, it just reminded me of like a playground bully. And not just like the I don't want you playing with my toys kind of bully, but the I'm going to hurt someone else because I have been hurt kind of bully. That oftentimes they act out of their own insecurity or their own fear. And because of that, they lash out to other people and attack others. That's what Sanballat reminded me of, except there's one big difference between Sanballat and the playground bully is that Sanballat's words were more than just hurtful and mean, but they were threats to Nehemiah and the Jewish people. Because this isn't the first time that he showed up in the story of Nehemiah. He showed up earlier, and in an earlier chapter, he was basically trying to cause and create tension between the Persian king Cyrus, that king that sent them along the way, and Nehemiah. He was trying to get Nehemiah in trouble so that the king would go against the decree that allowed them to leave in the first place. And so now, when he shows up again, when Sanballat shows up again and he's challenging Nehemiah, it says he was saying these things in front of his brothers and the army. In the context of this passage, it's not his actual brothers that he's saying this to, but he's saying this in front of other powerful friends and leaders who had armies of their own. And so in the context, this isn't just a group of pals gathering around talking, but this is a council of some really highly powerful people with military might behind them, all gathering together to come against what God is doing in Jerusalem and in Nehemiah. And so when we think about that, sometimes the criticism that we face is a good thing. We call that constructive criticism. I think that's pretty fitting for Nehemiah because it builds up, and that's Nehemiah's story. Right? That it's the kind of criticism that is not easy to hear. No criticism is ever easy to hear, but it's the kind of criticism that is for our good and not our defeat. It's the kind of criticism that our spouse may say to us, that our spouses will say to us, that a good friend might say, or a good boss or a pastor. But sometimes the criticism that we face is there to tear us down and to impose some kind of threat in our life. And that's what Sanballat was doing. All right, so maybe you begin serving in church, and your hope is to reach the lost and to serve God's people around you. And someone comes up to you and says, "Are you sure you can do that? Because you have a past, and I don't know if you're the one who's fit for that job. I don't know if God can use you because you've done some things." Or maybe you notice some corners that have been cut at work, that some people are going to be hurt because the job isn't being done as well as it should be, and some people are being taken advantage of. And a coworker or a manager or a partner comes up to you and says, "If you report these, then you'll never be looked at for a raise or for a promotion ever again." Sometimes that criticism that we face is to tear us down or to threaten us. And at the heart of that is a real enemy who is seeking to destroy us, who wants to stop the movement of God. So you can write this down too, that handling criticism is a part of leadership. So let's look back at Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 4 and 5. He says, "Hear, O God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads and give them up to be plundered in a land where they are captives. Do not cover their guilt and let not their sin be blotted out from your sight, for they have provoked you in anger in the presence of the builders." Now, we got to think about this for just a second, because Nehemiah was not in that circle of people. He wasn't standing in front of them when those words came out of Sanballat's mouth. So what happened is that he said those words in front of his army, in front of his friends, in front of their armies, and it began to spread. It began to spread in the enemy's camp, and they began to echo those words. And eventually, the Jews heard those words, and finally it reached Nehemiah's ear. And so this is talk that is being spread throughout the region, that the Jews are weak, that they can't do it, that they're not going to be able, that it's going to fall and it's going to crumble on them. And that was the popular narrative that was being spread throughout the region. And so when Nehemiah hears them, when Nehemiah hears these things that Sanballat said, his response is not to defend himself. He doesn't defend his honor saying, well, you just don't understand me. I can do this. He doesn't try to meet up with Sanballat or these people and say, hey, if you just understand our plan, it really is a good plan. We can even include you in on it if you want to be a part of it. He doesn't do that. And he doesn't sit there and sulk because people aren't approving of him doing it. What he does is he prays. He immediately prays, and he prays this honest prayer. And the words that come out of his mouth are, "Hear, O God, for we are despised." And I don't know if you have ever felt like that before, but I know I have. I know I have felt just despised, hated, like the world is set against me. And I have had those moments in my life. But Nehemiah, he recognized that these taunts and these criticisms, they're not rooted in truth, but they're rooted in fear and out of anger. He had this internal filter in his mind that was able to hear the words of his enemy, process them for what they really were, and move on. Instead of dwelling on the feeling of being despised, he took it to God and he got back to work. And I love this very next verse. In verse 6, it says, "So we built the wall, and all the wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work." Nehemiah's response was to pray and to build the wall. And I want us to just recognize that is a deep faith and a deep trust in God in that moment. That he was going to pray to God, say, "Lord, we need you to protect us. Turn the taunts back on them because we need your help." It was a deep trust and faith in God. And also, at the same time, it was moving towards the mission. Because they needed walls. They needed protection. That was the number one issue that they were facing. That was Nehemiah's whole entire purpose. And so they had to rely on God for the protection of his people. And while they're relying on God, they're also building the wall and practically advancing what they needed for protection. It was both trusting in God and working out of God's direction at the same time. So there will be criticism. I know we've experienced it. I know we will experience it. And especially we will experience it when we do things God's way. And objectively filtering that criticism is so important for us. But we have to then move into action. We have to then do something. And it's a kind of action that relies on the Lord, to plan a way forward, to provide the needs and to protect us in the process. But it's also an action that practically advances the mission God has given to you. And so I just want to encourage you, don't let criticism pull us away from God's mission for us. Don't let the criticism of the world pull us away from what God has called us to. But also, more than just criticism, there will be obstacles. Because the words of Sanballat weren't the worst thing that happened to them in this chapter. It gets worse for Nehemiah and the Jews. If we keep reading, in verse 7 it says, "But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, and that the breaches were beginning to be closed, they were very, very angry. And they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it." So those earlier threats and that earlier criticism that Sanballat said was now being formed into a reality of soldiers marching to Jerusalem. They were getting closer and closer. It was the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites. And there's something that we kind of have to break down. There's two things that we need to break down about those three people. That number one, that last group, the Ashdodites, they were from their capital city of Ashdod. And Ashdod was a former Philistine city. So these were former Philistines marching against Israel. And if you know your Jewish history, the Philistines were a historic enemy of Israel. Think David and Goliath, think Samson. Those are the Philistines. And so were the Ammonites. The Ammonites were a historical enemy of Israel. So two of the three groups have been opposing Israel for centuries, and they're coming against them. That's number one. Number two is that there are three groups, and the text seems to point that it's not just three groups, but it's three groups coming from three different regions. And so they are coming to Jerusalem and surrounding Jerusalem on at least three sides. So they are surrounded by their historical enemies. So Nehemiah, he had led them to build half of the wall. They had been making progress. They had been moving forward in what God had called them to do. And in spite of criticism, they were advancing anyways. And then they've gotten halfway done with the wall, and their enemy is knocking on the door. They were making gains, and now there's this massive, massive problem in front of them. And I just think that's just how things work, isn't it? Right? We think we're on track with something. We think we're doing the right thing. We think we're making steps. And, for example, we think we're getting our finances on track. We think we're finally saving up. We're spending our money. We're budgeting. We're being wise with what we spend our money on. And then our transmission goes out. And all the money that we saved up is gone, and we have to restart. What's that saying? One step forward, two steps back. Okay. Or maybe we desire to lead our family spiritually. And so we start having a consistent quiet time with Jesus. Maybe we reach out to our circles, to our friend groups for encouragement and accountability. We start hanging scriptures on our walls as a reminder. And then we get some kind of devastating news. Maybe we lost a family member, or we heard the news that we're losing our job. And now all of a sudden this desire to lead our family spiritually becomes much, much harder because now we're leading out of a place of desperation and of hurt. And it really feels like, and it's not always the case, but it really feels like we are taking one step forward and two steps back. I'm sure one day I'll share the whole story, but about 2 years ago, Britt and I felt like it was time for us to move and leave the church that we were serving at and find a new job, find somewhere else. And so we went on this multiple month-long process. It took like almost a year of us looking at other opportunities and just trying to find things. And it was just door after door being closed in our face. And we thought that there were opportunities that were coming, and then we got close to it, and then it just didn't pan out for us. And it was to the point where I was nearing my last paycheck. We knew the last date that I was going to get paid for, and I didn't have anything else lined up quite yet. There was no assurance that I was going to get a paycheck in the following months. And so it just seemed like obstacle after obstacle of just getting shut down, and it wasn't happening. But the entire time, we felt like this is what we needed to do, that this is what God was leading us to do. And at times we had to remind each other of that. But it was what we felt like God was leading us to do. And looking back now, we can see God's hand in it all. It's easy to see it, on the backside, but in the middle of it, it was rough because it was just obstacle after obstacle. And so I know some of y'all here are taking steps forward in whatever context that looks like for you. Whatever thing God is leading y'all in, I know many of y'all here this morning are taking steps forward in that. And so don't let discouragement get in the way of that thing that God is leading you to, because there will be obstacles. And so many God-given dreams die at the first obstacle. So just remember, we answer to God. When opposition comes at us from outside of the walls, we hold firm to the mission that God has given us and to the God who gave it to us. Verse 9, that's what Nehemiah does. He says, and we continued and we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. Nehemiah prayed to God and he advanced the mission. He took it to God and he got back to work. He didn't let the enemy discourage and distract him from outside of the walls. But the thing is that sometimes the more dangerous opposition doesn't come from outside of the walls, but it comes from inside of the walls. Because our enemy will try to discourage us from the inside too. Verses 10 through 12 says, in Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear the burdens is failing. There is too much rubble. By ourselves, we will not be able to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work. And at that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, you must return to us. The Jews, they were tired. They were overwhelmed. They were scared of the enemy right at their doorstep, afraid of death, and they were being dissuaded by their friends. And what was happening is that fear was spreading through the city. People, the Jews, were getting more and more afraid that this plan wasn't going to pan out the way that Nehemiah was telling them it was going to pan out. And we call this series 52 days because they built the wall in 52 days. But the thing is that no one told them that they were going to be building it in 52 days. So on day 24, they're thinking that it might happen or it might not. And when I was doing research for this, I found out that it was a 55-day trip from Jerusalem back to the Persian capital. Right? So back to that king that commissioned them in the first place. It was 55 days from Jerusalem back there. So you got to think it's 55 days until reinforcements come. It's 55 days until the king that commissioned you can send his forces to say, no, I actually did decree this, and this is what's going to happen. And so that number, that 55-day number, it's not that scary on day 53 when the walls are built, and you have some time. But on day 24, it's scary. And so what was going through the Jews' minds is that they had this countdown of, if they attack, it's 55 days after our messenger gets there. So that fear was running through their minds all the time. And I think it's a pretty safe bet that we have all been there at one point or another. Just being honest, I think sometimes my greatest opposition comes from inside my mind. Sometimes the thoughts that go through my mind are of not measuring up. That maybe they won't like me, or maybe I won't fit in, or what will people think about me? And sometimes I let that invade my mind so much so that I can miss out on gospel opportunities that are right in front of my face. Or even greater than that, sometimes I might think that I am not even capable of the love and the grace that Jesus offers me. That I can comprehend theologically that the basic concepts of grace and love. I get that. I know that. If I had to fill out a quiz today, I think I would ace it if they were easy questions. I can sing the song Amazing Grace. And at the same time, as I'm singing those words, Amazing Grace, I can be thinking, yeah, but those aren't for me. That's for everyone else in the room. And a little voice can be playing in the back of my head that your guilt and your shame is too much. That's not for you. And I know that there are some of us here this morning who have been worshiping and praising, singing these songs this morning, and I know that when you walk out into the parking lot, you're walking into a battle. I know that. I know that some of us are dealing with some things as soon as we leave these doors. So remember that discouragement and opposition, it will come. It's going to come. And so when it does, we take it to God and we get back to work. But there's good news in that too, that we don't have to be afraid. Remember the Lord. Verse 13 and 14, Nehemiah says, and this is after all of the Jews have been saying that we can't do it, we're too tired, they're gonna come and kill us without us even knowing it, that all of our friends are telling us not to do it. And Nehemiah says this. He says, in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, in open places, I stationed the people by their clans, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers and your sons and your daughters and your wives and your homes. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord and fight. Why do we not be afraid of them? Because the God of the universe is fighting for us. He is behind us. He is for us. He is with us. So don't be afraid of other people. And remember that this isn't the first time that God has led us through opposition, because the Lord who is great and awesome marched us across dry land in between the waters of the Red Sea. The Lord who is great and awesome led us across the Jordan into the promised land that he had kept for us. Remember that the Lord who is great and awesome rose up a nation from a family. That the Lord who is great and awesome defeated giants with a farmer boy. Remember that he had already done great things for his people, and he was going to continue to do it. So just remember. Man, remember how he's taking care of you. Remember the miracles that God has performed for us. Remember his word that says he has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of sound mind. Remember that greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world. Remember that if God is for us, who can be against us? That who can separate us from the love of God? Can trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? No, we are more than conquerors through Christ who gives us strength. That's our God. So don't be afraid. But remember the greatness and the goodness of God. And then he says, fight for your cause. I love that. Fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. Know your why. Why do we fight? Nehemiah, why do we fight against these people who are surrounding us? Why are we tirelessly working and trying to build this wall when we are surrounded by our enemies? He says, do it for the brothers around you. Do it for your families. Do it for your children. Do it for your home. And here's the thing, knowing why they were motivated, knowing why they were doing it, led them to what they needed to do. The why told them what. So fight for something bigger than ourselves. Fight for more than just the end result. Fight because your children need you. Fight because there's lives at stake. Fight because the marriage that you signed up for is a covenant relationship. Fight because the people in Waldron need us to fight for them. And I love this in verse 17 and 18, a little further down in the chapter. It says, those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other. And each of the builders had his sword strapped at his side while he built. The fight didn't stop just because there was work that was to be done. The laborers, the people who were hauling the material back and forth, they held the material, hauled it with one hand, and the other hand they carried a weapon. And all of the builders had a sword strapped to their side. And if you've ever done construction, the more stuff you have on your belt, it doesn't help. It loads you down, and it's really bulky. But they did it because they were ready. They were ready. They were ready for the work, and they were ready for the fight. And so I just want to leave us with this morning, is that there is a cosmic battle that is waging for your soul. That there's a spiritual fight going on for your attention, for your soul, for your heart, for who you are. And there's an enemy who wants to steal your joy and to crush your purpose and destroy your life. And Satan will oppose you. And he will try to discourage you. It's going to happen. And it'll happen from outside of the wall and inside. So when that comes, when that happens, we're going to root ourselves in the Word of God. It is the sword that we keep strapped to our side. And we're going to trust in the God who leads us into true salvation from whatever may discourage us. And we're going to get back to the work, back to the mission that God has called us to in the first place. And as we move forward in that mission, we have to fight for it. Side by side with other faithful families, for each other, for our families, for our marriages, for our kids, and for our city, we have to fight. So I want to leave us with that this morning. If you would stand up and pray with me as we close out this morning. Jesus, you are so, so good to us. Lord, and I know that you have been working in our lives, that you have been speaking to us, God, that you are moving us in directions for your kingdom. That as your hands and feet, you are marching us forward for the work that you have for your kingdom. And that you have put that in front of us to be a part of. And I also know that as we step into that work, that we're going to face opposition and we're going to face discouragement, and it's going to be hard. But there is good news in who you are. There is good news in your faithfulness to us. There is good news that you have done it before and you will do it again. So, Lord, I just pray this morning that we would all be encouraged to step out into that mission, to step out into that purpose that you have for our lives, that we would walk faithfully in what you have for us, knowing that there's an enemy set against us, but that you are with us. Lord, help us to just fight for your kingdom. We love you and we trust you and we praise the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. You guys have a great week.
When my hope is all but gone and I'm barely hanging on, God, you're still good to me. When my heart can't find a beat, when it's dark and I can see